The wind howled outside the beach house, rattling the shutters like a warning. Eleanor Grayson stood at the kitchen counter, her hands trembling as she sliced apples for a pie she no longer cared to bake. At 68, her life had been a tapestry of devotion, woven with threads of love for her husband, Thomas, and their shared dreams. The beach house in Cape May was their sanctuary, a place where 40 years of marriage had unfolded in laughter, quiet evenings, and promises kept. Or so she thought. She glanced at the framed photo on the counter, younger Eleanor and Thomas, arms entwined, standing on the shore with the house behind them. It was their first summer there, 1985, when the world felt infinite. Now, the photo seemed to mock her. The knife slipped, nicking her finger, and a bead of blood fell onto the cutting board. She barely noticed. The phone rang, shattering the silence. It was Margaret, her friend of 30 years, her voice tight with urgency. "Eleanor, we need to talk. It's about Thomas." Eleanor's heart sank. Margaret's tone carried a weight she'd never heard before, like a stone dropped into still water. "Can you meet me at the cafe in town? Now." Eleanor drove through the drizzle, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the windshield. The cafe was nearly empty, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. Margaret sat in a corner booth, her face pale, her hands clasped around a mug of untouched coffee. Eleanor slid into the seat across from her, dread coiling in her chest. "Eleanor," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, but I can't keep it from you any longer." She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "Thomas, he's been seeing someone. For months." The words hit Eleanor like a wave, cold and suffocating. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Thomas would never." "It's true," Margaret interrupted, her eyes brimming with tears. "And it's with Claire." Eleanor froze. Claire, her closest friend since their college days, the woman who'd stood by her at her wedding, who'd shared countless secrets over wine-soaked evenings. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined, a double wound that tore through her heart. "Claire," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How do you know?" Margaret slid her phone across the table, revealing a string of text messages. Screenshots of conversations between Thomas and Claire, laced with intimacy that made Eleanor's stomach churn. Dates, times, places, proof of stolen moments in the very town where Eleanor had built her life with Thomas. The final message was dated last week. Sent from Claire's number, "Meet me at the beach house." Eleanor's in the city. Eleanor's vision blurred. The beach house, their sacred place, defiled. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go," she said, her voice hollow. Margaret reached for her, but Eleanor was already out the door, the rain soaking her as she stumbled to her car. Back at the beach house, she wandered through the rooms, each one a museum of memories now tainted. The living room where they'd danced to old records, the bedroom where they'd whispered dreams under the moonlight, the porch where they'd watched countless sunsets. All lies. She sank onto the couch, clutching the photo from the kitchen, her tears falling onto the glass. By morning, the shock had hardened into resolve. Eleanor wasn't the fragile woman Thomas and Claire might have expected. She'd spent decades building a life, raising their daughter, Sarah, and nurturing their marriage. She'd been loyal, steadfast, the keeper of their shared history. But loyalty, she realized, was a currency she'd spent too freely. She called Sarah, now 35 and living in Boston. "Your father's been unfaithful," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. With Claire. Sarah's gasp crackled through the phone, followed by a torrent of questions Eleanor couldn't answer. I'm coming down, Sarah said. Don't do anything until I get there. But Eleanor couldn't wait. The betrayal burned too fiercely. She contacted a real estate agent, a brisk woman named Linda who'd sold half the properties in Cape May. I want to sell the beach house, Eleanor said, her voice unwavering. As soon as possible. Linda hesitated. Are you sure? That house is a gem. You and Thomas. I'm sure. Eleanor cut in. Draw up the papers. The decision felt like severing a limb, but it was also a reclaiming. The beach house, once a symbol of love, was now a monument to deceit. Selling it would be her first step toward freedom, a declaration that she would not be defined by Thomas's betrayal. As she hung up, the doorbell rang. It was Thomas, his face a mask of concern. Eleanor, where were you last night? I was worried. She stared at him, the man she'd loved for 4 decades, and saw a stranger. Don't, she said, her voice cold. I know about you and Claire. His face crumpled, but she didn't wait for his excuses. She turned away, leaving him in the doorway, the wind howling behind him. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a spark of something new. Anger. Yes, but also strength. She would rebuild, starting with the sale of the beach house. And she would do it alone. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and pain. Eleanor moved through the beach house like a ghost, packing away memories while the real estate agent, Linda, worked to list the property. Every corner of the house held a story. Sarah's first steps on the hardwood floor, the summers spent painting the porch, the quiet mornings when Thomas would bring her coffee as the waves crashed outside. Now, each memory was a wound, reopened with every box she taped shut. Sarah arrived from Boston, her face a mix of fury and heartbreak. How could he do this? She demanded, pacing the living room. And Claire? Mom. She was like family. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She didn't trust herself to speak without breaking. Instead, she handed Sarah a cup of tea and sat beside her, the silence heavy with shared betrayal. I'm selling the house, Eleanor said finally. It's the only way. Sarah's eyes widened. This place. Mom, you love this house. It's us. Not anymore, Eleanor replied, her voice firm. It's tainted. I can't stay here knowing what happened. Sarah argued, pleaded, but Eleanor was resolute. The beach house was a dream she'd shared with Thomas, and that dream was dead. Selling it was her way of cutting the ties that bound her to his betrayal. She didn't tell Sarah about the nights she'd spent crying in the dark, or the moments she'd doubted herself, wondering if she'd failed him somehow. Those thoughts she kept locked away, even from her daughter. Linda called with updates. We've got interest already, she said, her voice bright with professional enthusiasm. A young couple from Philadelphia, and a retiree looking for a summer home. I'll bring them by tomorrow. Eleanor agreed, though the thought of strangers walking through her home made her skin crawl. She spent the evening sorting through old letters and photos, deciding what to keep and what to burn. In a drawer, she found a letter Thomas had written her years ago, promising eternal love. She tore it to pieces, the scraps falling like ash. The next day, the potential buyers arrived. The young couple, barely 30, wandered through the house with wide-eyed excitement, talking about renovations and summer parties. The retiree, a quiet man in his 70s, lingered on the porch, staring at the ocean. Eleanor watched them from the kitchen, her heart twisting. They saw a house. She saw a life. After they left, Linda sat with Eleanor at the dining table. The couple's ready to make an offer, she said. Above asking price. It's a great deal. Eleanor nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Claire, her laughter, her easy charm. How had she missed the signs? They'd spent countless evenings together. The three of them, Eleanor, Thomas, and Claire, sharing wine and stories. Had it all been a lie? The question gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She had to focus on moving forward. That night, Thomas called. Eleanor, please, he said, his voice thick with desperation. Let me explain. It wasn't what you think. Then what was it? She snapped, her anger flaring. You and Claire. In our house. Behind my back. What's there to explain? He stammered, his words a jumble of apologies and excuses. But Eleanor hung up. She didn't need his version of the truth. She had the evidence, the pain, and the resolve to reclaim her life. Selling the beach house was just the beginning. Sarah stayed for the week, helping Eleanor pack. They worked in silence, the weight of the decision settling over them. As they sorted through old clothes, Sarah found a scarf Claire had given Eleanor years ago. A soft blue thing with delicate embroidery. Throw it out, Eleanor said, her voice sharp. Sarah hesitated, then nodded, tossing it into the trash. By the end of the week, the offer from the young couple was finalized. Eleanor signed the papers, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest. The beach house would belong to someone else, and with it, the last tether to her old life. As she handed the papers to Linda, she felt a flicker of freedom, fragile but real. She wasn't just selling a house. She was letting go of the woman she'd been, the loyal wife who'd trusted too much. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the waves crash under a gray sky. The sale was nearly complete, the closing date set for next week. The beach house felt emptier now, its walls stripped of photos, its rooms echoing with absence. Sarah had returned to Boston, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the ghosts of her past. She hadn't spoken to Thomas since their last call, though he'd left voicemails, each one more pleading than the last. She deleted them without listening. Claire, too, had tried to reach out, sending a letter that Eleanor burned unopened. The betrayal was a wound too raw to touch, and she refused to let their words reopen it. Instead, she focused on practicalities. She met with a lawyer to discuss the financial implications of the sale. The beach house had been their most valuable asset, a nest egg for retirement. Now, it would fund a new chapter, one Eleanor would write alone. The lawyer, a kind woman named Diane, walked her through the details, her voice gentle but firm. You're making a bold move, Diane said. Not many would have the strength. Eleanor smiled faintly. It's not strength. It's survival. She spent her days sorting through what remained of her life in Cape May. She donated furniture, gave away trinkets, and kept only what felt essential: a few books, her mother's china, a quilt Sarah had made as a teenager. Each item she let go of was a step toward shedding the weight of her marriage. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, Eleanor found a box of old journals. They were hers, written in her 20s and 30s, filled with dreams of the life she'd build with Thomas. She sat on the dusty floor, reading pages that felt like they belonged to someone else. The young Eleanor had been so hopeful, so certain of love's permanence. She traced the faded ink, her heart aching for that woman. That evening, she walked to the beach, the journals tucked under her arm. The tide was low, the sand littered with shells. She built a small fire, the flames licking at the darkening sky, and fed the journals to it, one by one. The pages curled and blackened, their words dissolving into ash. It wasn't just the journals she was burning. It was the illusion of a perfect life. The next day, Linda called with news. The buyers want to move up the closing date, she said. They're eager to settle in before summer ends. Eleanor agreed, though the urgency felt like another loss. She had one last weekend in the house, one last chance to say goodbye. She spent it wandering the rooms, touching the walls, memorizing the creak of the floorboards. On Saturday night, she sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the ocean a restless murmur. For the first time, she let herself imagine a future without this place, without Thomas. The thought was terrifying but also exhilarating. She could move to the city, closer to Sarah. She could travel, see the places she'd only read about. She could be someone new, not just a wife, not just a betrayed woman. The possibilities stirred something in her, a quiet hope she hadn't felt in years. On Sunday, she invited Margaret over. They sat in the kitchen, the air heavy with unspoken apologies. I should have told you sooner, Margaret said, her eyes red. I saw them together at the market months ago, but I didn't want to believe it. Eleanor reached for her hand. You told me when it mattered. That's enough. They talked for hours, rebuilding the trust that Claire's betrayal had fractured. As Margaret left, she hugged Eleanor tightly. You're going to be okay, she whispered. Eleanor nodded, wanting to believe it. The closing was set for Monday. Eleanor packed her car, her belongings reduced to a few boxes. She took one last walk through the house, her footsteps echoing. At the front door, she paused, her hand on the knob. Goodbye, she whispered. To the house, to Thomas, to the life she'd known. Then she stepped outside, locking the door behind her. The closing took place in a sterile office in town, all glass and polished wood. Eleanor sat across from the young couple, their faces alight with excitement as they signed the papers. She forced a smile, her heart heavy but resolute. Linda handed her a check, the sum larger than she'd expected, a tangible weight in her hand. It was done. The beach house was no longer hers. She drove to a hotel in Philadelphia, needing distance from Cape May. The city buzzed around her, its noise a stark contrast to the quiet of the shore. She checked into a small room, the bed unfamiliar, the walls bare. For the first time in decades, she was untethered, no house, no husband, no obligations. The freedom was daunting, but she embraced it. Sarah called that night, her voice thick with worry. Mom, where are you? Are you okay? I'm in Philly, Eleanor said. And I'm figuring it out. They talked for an hour, Sarah's concern giving way to cautious optimism. You should come to Boston, she said. Start fresh. We can find you a place near me. Eleanor considered it. Boston was vibrant, full of possibilities. But it was also Sarah's world, not hers. She needed something of her own. I'll visit soon, she promised. But first, I need to do this my way. The next morning, she met with a financial advisor, a sharp woman named Rachel who helped her plan her next steps. The sale of the beach house had given her a substantial nest egg, enough to live comfortably for years. Rachel suggested investments, travel, perhaps a small condo in a city Eleanor loved. You have options, Rachel said, her eyes kind. More than you think. Eleanor spent the week exploring Philadelphia, walking its historic streets, visiting museums, sitting in cafes. She felt like a tourist in her own life, seeing the world through new eyes. At a bookstore, she bought a journal, its pages crisp and blank. She began writing again, Not the dreams of her youth, but the thoughts of a woman reborn. She wrote about loss, about anger, about the quiet strength she was discovering within herself. One evening, she received an email from Claire. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." Eleanor stared at it, her finger hovering over the delete button. Curiosity won out, and she opened it. The message was long, rambling, full of apologies and explanations. Claire claimed it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. She begged for forgiveness, for a chance to explain in person. Eleanor's hands shook as she typed a reply. There's nothing left to say. Don't contact me again. She hit send, then blocked Claire's email. The act was final. A door closed. She felt lighter, as if she'd shed another layer of her old self. She called Margaret, needing a friend's voice. They talked about everything but Thomas and Claire the weather. Margaret's Garden, a book they'd both read. It was a small step toward normalcy, a reminder that not all her relationships were broken. By the end of the week, Eleanor made a decision. She would travel, starting with a trip to Italy, a place she'd always dreamed of visiting. She booked a flight, her heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. The beach house money would fund this journey, a gift to herself after years of giving to others. As she packed for the trip, she thought of Thomas. He'd called again, leaving a message about wanting to meet, to fix things. She didn't call back. His betrayal had shattered her trust, but it had also freed her. She was no longer the loyal wife, defined by his choices. She was Eleanor, a woman with a future to claim. On her last night in Philadelphia, she walked to the Delaware River, the city lights reflecting on the water. She took out the photo of the beach house, the one she'd carried since that first night of betrayal. She tore it in half, letting the pieces fall into the river. They floated for a moment, then sank, carried away by the current. Eleanor watched them go, her heart steady, her eyes clear. Eleanor landed in Rome under a blazing September sun, the air thick with the scent of espresso and ancient stone. She'd chosen a small hotel near the Pantheon, its narrow streets alive with the hum of scooters and laughter. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of joy, fragile but real. Italy was her first act of defiance, a declaration that her life was not over. She spent her days wandering, her journal filling with sketches and thoughts. The Colosseum took her breath away, its weathered arches a testament to endurance. She imagined herself like those stones, worn but standing. At a cafe in Trastevere, she met a group of older women, fellow travelers, who invited her to join them for wine. Their story soft divorce, reinvention, adventure mirrored her own, and she felt less alone. One evening, as she sat by the Trevi fountain, she tossed a coin into the water, making a wish not for love, but for courage. She thought of the beach house, now someone else's home, and felt a pang of loss. But it was fleeting. The house had been a cage, she realized, one she'd decorated with her dreams. Selling it had set her free. She wrote to Sarah, describing the colors of Rome, the taste of fresh pasta, the warmth of strangers. I'm finding myself, she wrote. Or maybe I'm creating myself. Either way, I'm not the woman I was. Sarah's reply was full of pride, urging her to keep exploring, to visit Florence next. In Florence, Eleanor lost herself in art, standing before Botticelli's Birth of Venus with tears in her eyes. The goddess, emerging from the sea, felt like a mirror. Eleanor was emerging too, from the wreckage of her marriage, into something new. She bought a small painting from a street artist, a watercolor of the Arno River, to remind her of this moment. One night, she received a call from Thomas. She almost didn't answer. but curiosity and perhaps a need for closure made her pick up. His voice was weary, older than she remembered. "I've lost you, haven't I?" he said. Not a question, but a statement. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "You did." He apologized again, his words heavy with regret, but they no longer had power over her. She listened, then said, "I hope you find peace, Thomas. But it won't be with me." She hung up, her heart calm. The call was a final goodbye, not to the man she'd loved, but to the pain he'd caused. She traveled to Venice next, the canals reflecting her newfound clarity. She rented a small apartment for a month, wanting to linger. She took Italian lessons, her tongue stumbling over the words. But she laughed at her mistakes. She cooked for herself, simple meals that tasted of independence. She wrote in her journal every night, pages filled with hope. One afternoon, she met an older man named Luca at a bookstore. He was a retired professor, his eyes kind, his English accented but clear. They talked about literature, about loss, about starting over. He invited her to a lecture on Dante, and she went, feeling a connection that was not romantic but human, a reminder that she could still form bonds. As her time in Italy neared its end, Eleanor felt a shift. The woman who'd arrived in Rome, broken and uncertain, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd chosen herself. She booked a flight to Paris, her next adventure, and packed her bags with a sense of purpose. On her last night in Venice, she stood on a bridge over the Grand Canal, the water shimmering under the moon. She thought of the beach house, of Thomas, of Claire. They were part of her story, but not its ending. She was writing that now, with every step, every choice. And for the first time, she was eager to see where it led. Paris welcomed Eleanor with autumn's golden light, the Seine sparkling under bridges strung with lovers' locks. She settled into a small apartment in Le Marais, its windows overlooking cobblestone streets. The city felt alive, pulsing with history and possibility. At 68, she was no longer afraid of being alone. She was learning to cherish it. She spent her days exploring, her journal now a constant companion. The Louvre overwhelmed her, its vastness a reminder of how much there was to discover. She lingered before the Mona Lisa, not for the painting itself, but for the crowd, their faces alight with wonder. She felt part of something larger, a shared human longing for beauty. In a cafe near Notre Dame, she met Sophie, a French woman in her 70s who ran a book club. Sophie invited Eleanor to join, and she did, finding solace in discussing novels with strangers who became friends. They read a room of one's own, and Eleanor felt Virginia Woolf's words like a call to action. She would carve out her own space, her own life. She wrote to Sarah, describing Paris's magic, the croissants that melted in her mouth, the music that drifted from street corners. "I'm not running away," she wrote. "I'm running towards something." Sarah's reply was a photo of herself holding a plane ticket to Paris. "I'm coming for Christmas," she wrote. Eleanor's heart swelled. One morning, while walking through the Tuileries garden, Eleanor saw a couple in their 60s, hand in hand, laughing. For a moment, she felt a pang for Thomas, not the man who'd betrayed her, but the one she'd loved in her youth. She let the feeling pass, like a cloud over the sun. She was no longer defined by that love, or its loss. She started volunteering at a community center, teaching English to immigrants. The work was challenging but rewarding, her students' gratitude a balm for her wounds. One student, a young woman from Syria named Amal, shared stories of her own losses: family, home, a life left behind. Eleanor listened, her heart opening. She realized her pain, though real, was not unique. It connected her to others, a thread of shared humanity. One evening, Sophie invited her to a dinner party. The guests were a mix of ages, their conversations lively and warm. Eleanor felt at ease, her laughter genuine. A man named Pierre, a retired journalist, asked about her life. She told him about the beach house, about Thomas, about her journey to Paris. He listened, his eyes kind, and said, "You've turned loss into courage. That's rare." She blushed, unaccustomed to praise. Later, as they walked along the Seine, Pierre shared his own story of divorce and reinvention. They parted as friends, but his words stayed with her. She was courageous, not because she was fearless, but because she kept moving forward. Christmas arrived, and Sarah joined her in Paris. They spent the holiday wandering markets, sipping hot chocolate, talking late into the night. Sarah confessed her own fears about her career, her future, her ability to trust after what Thomas had done. Eleanor held her daughter's hand, offering the wisdom she'd gained. "We rebuild," she said, "not because it's easy, but because we're worth it." On New Year's Eve, they stood on the Pont Alexander III, watching fireworks light up the sky. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for Sarah, for Paris, for the woman she was becoming. The beach house was a distant memory, its sale a stepping stone to this moment. She'd lost a home but found a world. As January dawned, Eleanor decided to stay in Paris a little longer. She enrolled in a painting class, her fingers clumsy but eager. She painted the Seine, the Eiffel Tower, the faces of her new friends. Each stroke was a declaration of her new life, vibrant and unapologetic. She was no longer just a wife, or a betrayed woman. She was Eleanor, and she was enough. Spring in Paris brought blossoms and a softer light, and Eleanor felt herself blooming too. She extended her lease on the apartment, her life in Le Marais now a tapestry of routines and discoveries. She taught English twice a week, attended book club, and painted on weekends. Her canvases were amateur but heartfelt, each one a piece of her new identity. Sarah visited again, bringing news from home. Thomas had moved to a small apartment in Cape May, living alone. Claire had left town, her reputation tarnished. Eleanor listened, surprised by how little it stirred her. The pain was still there, but it was duller now, like a bruise fading. She wished Thomas no harm, but she no longer wished him well either. He was part of her past, not her future. She began writing a memoir, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. She wrote about the beach house, about love and betrayal, about the courage to start over. The words poured out, raw and honest. Sophie read the early chapters and urged her to keep going. "This is your story," she said. "It deserves to be told." One afternoon, while painting in the Luxembourg Gardens, Eleanor met a woman named Marie, a sculptor in her 60s. Marie's hands were strong, her eyes sharp with wisdom. They talked about art, about loss, about the beauty of late-life reinvention. Marie invited Eleanor to an art exhibition, and she went, feeling a spark of connection. They became friends, meeting weekly to sketch or share coffee. Eleanor's memoir grew, each chapter a step toward healing. She wrote about the beach house not as a loss, but as a sacrifice necessary letting go. She wrote about Claire's betrayal, not with anger, but with clarity, seeing it as a catalyst for her transformation. She wrote about Thomas, not as a villain, but as a man who'd made choices she could not forgive. One evening, Pierre invited her to a concert at Sainte-Chapelle. The music, soaring through the stained glass chapel, moved her to tears. Afterward, they walked through the Latin Quarter, the air cool and fragrant. Pierre spoke of his own journey, of finding purpose after loss. "You remind me," he said, "that life doesn't end with heartbreak. It begins again." Eleanor smiled, her heart light. She wasn't ready for romance, but she was open to friendship, to connection. Pierre became a regular part of her life, their conversations a source of comfort and joy. She realized she was building a community, a network of souls who saw her not as a wife or a victim, but as Eleanor. She sent the first draft of her memoir to Sarah, who read it in one sitting. "Mom, this is incredible," she said over the phone. "You have to publish it." Eleanor laughed, unsure but intrigued. The idea of sharing her story with the world was daunting, but it also felt right. She'd spent so long living for others. Now, she would speak for herself. In May, she traveled to the south of France, staying in a small village near Nice. The Mediterranean reminded her of Cape May, but it was untainted by memory. She swam in the sea, her body buoyant, her mind clear. She wrote in her journal, painted the coastline, and felt a deep peace. The beach house was gone, but the sea was still hers. Back in Paris, she met with a small publisher Sophie knew. They were interested in her memoir, suggesting edits but praising its heart. Eleanor hesitated, then signed a contract. The process was daunting, but she was ready. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was for anyone who'd ever had to start over. As summer approached, Eleanor felt a shift. She was no longer running from her past, but building toward her future. She was a writer, a teacher, a friend, a mother. She was Eleanor, and she was whole. By summer, Eleanor's memoir was in its final edits, set for publication the following spring. She titled it The House I Let Go, a nod to the beach house and the life she'd released. The publisher sent her a mock-up of the cover, a watercolor of a shore at dusk, and she cried when she saw it, not from sadness, but from pride. She stayed in Paris, her life now a rhythm of teaching, writing, and painting. Her English students threw her a small party when she told them about the book, their broken English full of congratulations. Amal, her Syrian student, gave her a handmade bracelet, a token of gratitude. Eleanor wore it every day, a reminder of the lives she'd touched. Sarah visited for the summer, staying for a month. They traveled to Provence, wandering lavender fields and medieval villages. Sarah confessed she'd been inspired by Eleanor's courage, quitting her stressful job to pursue a career in nonprofit work. "You showed me it's never too late," she said, her eyes shining. Eleanor hugged her, feeling their bond deepen. One evening, Pierre invited Eleanor to dinner at his apartment. He cooked, the meal simple but delicious, and they talked late into the night. He read a chapter of her memoir and offered gentle feedback, his insights sharp but kind. As she left, he kissed her cheek, a gesture that felt like friendship but held a hint of something more. She wasn't ready, but she didn't rule it out. In August, Eleanor returned to Cape May for the first time since the sale. She didn't visit the beach house. Its new owners deserved their peace, but she walked the shore, the sand familiar under her feet. The town felt smaller, its hold on her weaker. She met Margaret for coffee, their friendship now stronger than ever. "You look different," Margaret said. "Lighter." "I am," Eleanor replied. She told Margaret about Paris, about the memoir, about the woman she was becoming. Margaret listened, her eyes bright with pride. "You didn't just survive," she said. "You thrived." Before leaving, Eleanor stopped by the cemetery where her parents were buried, a short drive from Cape May. She hadn't visited in years, but she needed to feel their presence. She spoke to them, telling them about her journey. Her voice steady. "I'm okay," she said. "More than okay." Back in Paris, the memoir's release date loomed. Eleanor felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She invited her book club, her students, and Pierre to a small launch party at a local bookstore. The event was intimate, the room filled with faces she'd come to love. She read a chapter aloud, her voice trembling at first, then growing strong. The applause was warm, genuine, and she felt a rush of gratitude. The memoir sold modestly but steadily, its reviews praising its honesty and heart. Readers wrote to Eleanor, sharing their own stories of betrayal and rebirth. She answered every letter, her words a lifeline to others. She realized her story had become a beacon, a reminder that pain could lead to purpose. As autumn returned, Eleanor stood on her balcony, the Paris skyline aglow. She thought of the beach house, of Thomas, of Claire. They were chapters in her story, but not the whole book. She'd sold the house, but she'd gained a world. She was 68, and her life was just beginning. She opened her journal, writing a single line, "I am enough." Then she closed it, her heart full, ready for whatever came next.